The Mayflower 400th anniversary. What exactly is the Mayflower? The Mayflower was not intended to be an open-going sea vessel. Its main purpose was as a cargo ship that services Western European ports, and in particular those of France, Holland, Denmark, and the British Isles. There's also some evidence that it visited the Norwegian coast. Its master, Christopher Jones, was from Harwich, that's a port in England on the Kent coast. This particular vessel was commissioned there sometime around 1609. The Pilgrims hired the Mayflower and the Speedwell to take them to the New World on the condition that they would work for certain merchants in fishing and the fur trade, a sort of indentured servitude for a period of 7 years. 26 other ships were named the Mayflower. This was apparently a common name. The Speedwell originally left Plymouth for the New World but had to turn back due to leakage. Some of those from the Speedwell went to the Mayflower, further exacerbating the crowding on that ship. The passengers were housed on the gun deck in very tight quarters. Each family had the area about the size of a queen bed for sleeping and passing the time. The ceiling was about 5 feet high, meaning that most adults would need to stoop over to avoid hitting their heads on the ceiling, in this case for them. Passengers would pass the time by reading by candlelight or playing cards and games. They consumed large amounts of alcohol, such as beer, with meals. This was known to be safer than water, which often came from polluted sources and caused disease. During the voyage across the Atlantic, the ship suffered a broken, cracked main beam, a supporting timber that runs a beam of the ship from port to starboard, and cracked in the middle next to the main mast. The timber cracked in the upper deck was in danger of falling down to the gun deck below, but fortunately one of the passengers had brought along a huge jack screw used for raising houses, which they placed underneath the beam to hold it up until they were finished with their voyage. The Mayflower arrived in what today is Cape Cod, Massachusetts on 11 or 21 November 1620, a voyage of about 10 weeks. They had originally intended to travel to the Virginia Commonwealth, but weather had landed them in the Cape Cod area of what is today the state of Massachusetts. The Mayflower cruise, such as was left of it, set sail back to England on 15 April 1621, arriving 9 May 1621, in about half the time that the voyage took to the New World. The westerly winds meant they could more or less ride the wind back home, whereas the outbound voyagers had to fight the wind continually. So after returning, the Mayflower made at least one more voyage, carrying cargo and returning with a cargo of salt from Rochelle, France in October of 1621. On March 1622, Master Jones died in Surrey, England, with no further records of what happened to the Mayflower until 1624, when it was appraised as virtually worthless at his probate hearing, most likely sold for scrap. So who were these Pilgrims? The Pilgrims, as we call them today, were English separatists, Puritans for the most part. They believed that the Church of England had become polluted to the point of heresy, and they felt compelled by their religious convictions to attempt to revert to a more pure form of Christianity, separate from the organized religious orders of the day, thus the names Puritan and Separatist. The real desire was to return to England at some point and replace the Church of England with a more pious and holy church according to their convictions. While they eventually settled in the New World in what is today Massachusetts, they originally did not intend to permanently leave England. They fled to Holland in 1609 to the city of Leyden, which had a large university and which was the center of religious freedom and enlightenment in Europe at the time. Although they were safe there for a time, their desire was to leave Holland. Because of their separation from the Church of England, they were considered illegal radicals and traitors in England. Some families traveled together, while some men came alone, leaving families in England and Leyden, Holland. Not all the passengers aboard the Mayflower were pilgrims. More than a third were the separatists we today call pilgrims, while the rest were hired hands, servants, or farmers recruited by London merchants, all originally destined for the colony of Virginia. While the Puritans and the Pilgrims were essentially both Puritans, the difference was the Puritans, as in this graphic, stayed behind in England with the intent of reforming the Church of England from inside, whereas the Pilgrims, being separatists, believed that there was no fixing the Church of England and they needed to create a form of Christianity which was more pious and holy. And here's a good example of all the folks that came aboard the ship and those that survived the first winter. So why did they leave Holland in the first place? Well, they were largely country folk who were agrarian by their skill set, and they found urban life in Holland hard to adjust to. It was difficult for them to find work, so they were in a state of poverty most of the time. They were also very concerned by the influence the more liberal culture of Holland was having upon their young people, so they urgently sought a different path for their people than either England, in which they suffered great persecution, or Holland. They felt that there was no place where they could live in freedom to practice their religion and raise their families in peace and without persecution like they experienced in England. And this was confirmed in their minds when King James I of England formed a pact with Spain against Holland, which specifically stipulated that should Spain prevail, there would be no independent English church congregations in Holland. It appeared that Holland would fall to the Spanish, and this presented a distinct danger to them and their families. They couldn't all leave, as many did not have the funds to support themselves on the journey, so the decision was made to send forth mostly the young and strong on the voyage, and to send for the rest of the congregation at some later date. William Bradford, who became the second governor of Plymouth later in this history, noted the sad parting in his journal, where he said, "Truly doleful was the sight of that sad and mournful parting, to see what sighs and sobs and prayers did sound among them, what tears did gush from every eye, and the pithy speeches pierced each heart." In July 1620 they left Holland for Southampton, England, aboard the Speedwell, where they would accompany the Mayflower to the New World in September of 1620. At some point, though, the Speedwell developed a leak and had to be repaired, which delayed their start until about August of 1620, while repairs were being made. They weren't the first Europeans to come to the New World either, by the way. The Spanish had established colonies in the New World in Florida and southwestern parts of North American continent. The French established colonies in what's now Canada in the 16th century. The English also had a presence in the New World. It's a good example of St. Augustine, Florida, established by the Spaniards in 1565. La Place Royale, which is actually Montreal, was established in 1611. Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607. The Kennebec River Plantation, founded in Maine in 1607. There was a very harsh beginning for these folks. Because they started late across the North Atlantic, they had little food and no time to plant crops, with a small amount of grain they could spare when they arrived in the New World in 1620. They also did not have the proper clothing for the harsh winter there. For the most part, they stayed up on board the ship and ventured onto shore to work on their meager dwellings and forage for food during the harsh winter of 1620. There was also some type of plague that struck all of them at once, and over half of them died from the disease, complicated by the scurvy they had been suffering due to being on the ship without proper food for such a long time. They buried their dead in a common grave to keep the Native Americans uninformed as to their real numbers. So who were the indigenous people that they encountered? The people that they encountered were the Wampanoags. They lived in southeastern Massachusetts and in Rhode Island at the beginning of the 17th century, at the time of first contact with the English colonists. It was a territory that included the islands of Martha's Vineyards and Nantucket as known today. Their populations numbered in the thousands. 3,000 Wampanoag lived in Martha's Vineyard alone. From 1615 to about 1619, the Wampanoag suffered an epidemic thought to be smallpox or leptospirosis that decimated their tribe. It suggested that this event so decimated their numbers that encounters with the Pilgrims were sparse, and the Native Americans were in no position to defend their home against what they perceived initially as an invasion. The Wampanoag originally spoke Wampanoag, a dialect of the Massachusetts language which belongs to the Algonquin language family. The early contacts between Europeans and the Wampanoag date from the earliest 16th century, as European merchant ships and fishing expeditions were common along the northeast coast of the North American continent. Captain Thomas Hunt captured several members of the tribe and sold them as slaves to the Spanish in 1614, one of whom was an individual named Tisquantum, otherwise known as Squanto today. The Spanish monks who took him in were attempting in vain to convert him to Christianity. They set him free, and he became an independent interpreter for an expedition to Newfoundland from England, from which he made his way back to Cape Cod. When the Pilgrims arrived and made contact with him, they were surprised and pleased to learn that he spoke English. In scouting the area around Plymouth, the Pilgrims found stores of buried corn that the Wampanoag had placed there, but because the pandemic had so decimated their numbers, there was no one to eat the grain. These stores helped to sustain them for the first winter and were also part of the planted crops when spring came. Tisquanto and other members of the Wampanoag tribe signed a treaty of mutual protection. They took care of each other because their numbers had been so reduced. The natives welcomed this help and returned favor by teaching the Pilgrims how to grow the three sisters, otherwise known as corn, beans, and squash. The next year at harvest, there was a very large bounty of food that was grown by the Pilgrims, and they were so thankful that they had the Feast of Thanksgiving, which we have today. It lasted for 3 whole days. Before landing in the New World, there was a great deal of strife between the Pilgrims and the rest of the passengers and crew of the Mayflower, to such a degree that a system of governing the raw passions was necessary if they were to survive. There was a great fear that their very survival depended upon establishing some type of order. It was an agreement that sought to keep order and to respect each person's right to life and liberty. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement between the heads of all the families and the crew members and other travelers to establish their own just government and to agree to abide by the laws that government established. And the Mayflower Compact reads, "In the name of God, Amen, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our King and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue thereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness thereof we have hereunder subscribed our names, Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England, France, and Ireland, 18th, and of Scotland, 54th, Anno Domini 1620. The Compact is often described by scholars as the earliest document that codifies the desire of free people to enact a just government and is beneficial to all. It's the forerunner of our own Declaration of Independence, and it heavily weighed upon the hearts of our founding fathers as they were engaged in the American Revolution some 150 years later. The effect of the Pilgrim settlement on U.S. history and destiny was such that while only a small part of the history of this country, the experience of the Pilgrim settlement in Plymouth had a profound effect upon our history and the development of our government and the laws developed from them. The Mayflower Compact showed that people acting in a just way, in the absence of a sovereign, could develop a rudimentary means of self-government. Not all those who agreed to the compact were separatists, but all who did realize there was a need to develop rules that they would all adhere to for their own survival as a society. This would later influence our founding fathers in development of the U.S. Declaration of Independence as well as the U.S. Constitution, according to History.com. Finally, as the first Constitution of the New World, the Mayflower Compact laid the foundations of two other revolutionary documents, the Declaration of Independence, which stated government derives their powers from the consent of the governed, and the Constitution. In 1802, speaking at Plymouth, the future president, John Quincy Adams, underscored the lasting importance of the agreement signed aboard the Mayflowers more than 180 years earlier, calling it perhaps the only instance in human history of that positive, original social compact which speculative philosophers have imagined as the only legitimate source of government. They knew as students of history that power corrupts and must be checked if there was to be individual freedom. As devout Christians, they knew that liberty had to be tempered by an internal moral code that was derived from God. As John Adams once stated, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. History had taught that lack of an internal moral code to govern the individual, coupled with individual liberty, leads to nihilism, corruption, and the decline of a civilized society. A little-known monument not far from Plymouth, Massachusetts, encapsulates what the Pilgrims believed about the functioning of a free society, which were influential to founding us as a nation. It also shows us the path to reclaim it if that is our wish. Mr. Hammett Billings, a Boston architect, illustrator, and sculptor, originally conceived of the monument as a 150-foot tall or 46-meter tall structure comparable to the Colossus of Rhodes. It was dedicated on August 1, 1889 by the Grand Lodge of Masons in Massachusetts. The National Monument to the Forefathers has as its centerpiece the statue representing faith. Surrounding it at its base are four other figures: morality, law, education, and liberty. Faith reflects the central importance of religious freedom in inspiring the Pilgrim's journey from Holland. Faith holds the scriptures in her left hand, and her right hand is pointed towards the heavens, reflecting the divine inspiration that guided them. Morality cradles the 10 Commandments in her left hand and the scroll of Revelation in her lap, representing prophecy and evangelism. Law is seated and has 2 tablets cradled in his left hand, depicting the laws that govern free peoples, and codifies that a free society must be one where the law applies equally to all people. Education depicts a seated woman with her head adorned with olive branches to signify peace while clutching books in her left hand. The books signify our responsibility to bring up our children in wisdom and morality. Liberty, the final statue, is a seated warrior, a broken chain in his right hand, and a sword in the other, depicting the notion that freedom is never free. On this day 400 years ago, our Pilgrim fathers and mothers came to this land. Little could they know at the time how grand an experiment their act of faith had launched. They had no inkling that what they had started and all that they had suffered through would someday become the largest, grandest, and most prosperous nation in history. We have inherited this and are blessed by the God of heaven with such unmatched bounty, and with it a great responsibility. Like that, the Statue of Liberty at the foot of the monument we discussed, we must look out over the horizon and grasp the cost of keeping this place. It is our responsibility for our posterity to keep it as a lasting tribute to our founders and a sacred trust our Creator has charged us with. In conclusion, on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower voyage, we can and must say, God bless America.